Hello, and how are you doing today? I want to do a video to wrap up what we have covered so far for building the Fishcard, specifically on the front-end side, powered by Blazor Web Assembly. If you are new to this series, I hope you could use this as a roadmap to go back to the topics that we talked about. And for people building the Fishcard with me, this is going to be a review. I'll start with where we are today. Then I plan to cover some tips and tricks that is related to Blazor. Then I'll do an assessment on the architecture level of the Fishcard today and articulate strategy-wise how are we going to move on to building the backend. Okay, let's dive in. So far, I have built the Fishcard twice. The one that is released is at fishcard.codewizard.net. And the other we built together. This one may not look as polished, but we build them step by step, right? By the way, both of them are open sourced, and we're going to put the link to the source code in the description below. We started by talking about the routing and navigation, and we use that to route the traffic to the page that we are building. We also talked about two types of parameters handling. If you want to reveal any concepts there, the links to the right up corner. Then we talked about the reader components, and we all understand now components are classes. We actually went deeper than that. We decompiled the code and checked the render method to understand better for the components. And in that video, we also talked about pages, layouts, app component, and so on, right? And then we talk about user interacting, binding the user inputs into the model, put up a data list to assist in typing. We use the JSON to host the fish data, and we use the dependency injection to host the service that populates the fish and the recommendations. And in the last video, we talked about styles, the global CSS and the isolated CSS. I think that is pretty much all you need to get started. I believe many of you interested in Blazor Web Assembly because you have a strong C# background and you are seeking for applying your skills into the front end. And it is not difficult to assume that aligns with the goal of Blazor. I came from that place and I experienced some mysterious at the very beginning. So I'm going to share this with you and I hope you find this useful. The first thing that I want to talk about is this _imports.razor file. It holds shared using for all your Razor components. For example, if I get rid of this fishcard.frontend.shared namespace, the app component will be broken. That's because it cannot recognize the class of Fishcard layout any further. To fix that, we could either put the using on top of the component so that the namespace of fishcard.frontend.shared will be imported into this specific component, or we could go back to imports.razor and uncomment the code, and then this namespace will be treated as if it is imported in all the Razor pages or Razor components. The concept behind it is kind of like a global using. Oh, by the way, there's a new feature, different implementations of global using in C#10. Come back to Blazor. It's more of an opinion or personal choice for you to use global using, or you want to use the using explicitly in each component. But the point is, class in a different namespace is not mysteriously show up, and you have the choice to choose how to use different namespaces. Second tips also related to namespace. This one's simple. All the Razor components use the naming convention for the namespaces, and that is your assembly name.folders. For example, the namespace for fishcardhome.razor is fishcard.frontend.pages. Fishcard.frontend is the assembly name, and pages is the folder name. And for Fishcard layout, since it is in the shared folder, the namespace is going to be fishcard.frontend.shared. The rule is easy to understand, but when you reference one component from another, especially when they are separated in different folders, you need to use the namespace properly. either through the component or through the global using. Tip 3 is around the isolated CSS. I mentioned it in the last video, I just want to repeat it here. In index.html, this project name.styles.css file, it is generated. You don't see it in the source, but it will be there. And when it is missing, for example, if it is deleted by accident, those isolated CSS styles to the side of the razor going to be gone. So if when you try to apply some CSS in the isolated CSS file and the style is not applied, this might be the reason. The last tip that I have is about the launch settings file. It is simple once you know it's there. When you're debugging locally, this is the configuration file for the host to use to decide how to behave. For example, you could define environmental variables for debugging, or you could set up like which port will the application to be hosted on for HTTPS or for plain HTTP. For example, if we want to change the debugging port from 7283 to 7284 and we run it, it's going to be 7284. Those are small things to know. Now let's talk about something big, way bigger. Where does it fit architecture-wise for Blazor Web Assembly application in a modern distributed application? My opinion on that, it is a JavaScript in C#. A distributed application looks like this in a very abstract way. You have a logic, you have a data, and that's your backend. You also have one piece that is running inside the browser. That piece is a client or front end. And that's a Fishcard will be built today. Now, when we use .NET Stack, the logic cap on the backend is probably ASP.NET Web API in C#. And data is going to be hosted on some other server, SQL, NoSQL. I'm going to leave it out of the discussion here. Just when you read this chart, please don't literally think that it's a SQL database. It's just generally anything that holds data. For the client though, it is a word of JavaScript. Or depends on the perspective, it is TypeScript as well. Deal is, it is not C#. But the question is, why cannot it be C#? The browsers weren't powerful enough, and it is now. C# compiles to IL. IL runs on the runtime, and we didn't have a runtime in the browser until we do lately that it's based on the WebAssembly. And that's where the Blazor is. And there are several benefits. Firstly, it's C# we are already familiar with. Secondly, it makes it easier to share the code in between the client and the backend. For example, data contracts. And fish item could be serialized into JSON from the backend, transferred over the internet to the front end. And then it could be deserialized back to an fish item. Since the backend and the front end both use C#, we can then design it to put the fish item into a class library, and it will be shared in between the front end and the back end, and there won't be contract out of sync any further. And compare it to JavaScript on the client side, there's a strong type validation. Of course, there's the chances to share the logic as well. Validation, for example, you might want to do it both on the client side and the server side. And you write once, put it in the class library, then share it in both sides. Of course, it is not only advantages. There are some things that we need to pay attention to. The biggest thing, in my opinion, is for you to switch the mindset that the code for the client is running inside a browser. Sometimes, because of the familiarity of the language, it's going to lure you want to do something that is wacky. For example, you might want to directly access the database from the WebAssembly project. You probably won't put a connection string to your JavaScript project. You should not do that for the Blazor Web Assembly project as well. Remember, it is JavaScript in C#. It runs in browser, and it should be treated as if everything is opened to the client. Another common mistake is authorization on the client side. Like any SPA, it's not going to work. A rule of thumb, again, is to treat your C# code as if it is JavaScript. Do what JavaScript is supposed to do. Today, the fish data is in the JSON file in the front end, and in the next couple of videos, I'm going to show you how to move the data from front end to the back end, and how to properly do the authentication and authorization. Generally, we're going to build a web API together as a backend to the Fishcard. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Give me a thumb up, keep coding, keep improving, and I will see you in the next one. Until then, take care.